At 9:34 a.m., a single Japanese transmission crackled through the Pacific airwaves. It was supposed to be secret. Instead, it signed the death warrant of the man who planned Pearl Harbor. The message reached the intercept station on Guadalcanal first, just a burst of static, dots, and dashes carried by the wind across 1,000 miles of ocean. The operator, a 23-year-old Navy ensign named Harold Miller, leaned closer to his headset, scribbling letters onto a pad. The code was JN 25D, the same Japanese naval cipher that had haunted the Americans since 1941. He didn't understand what it said, but he knew who to call. Within the hour, a sealed pouch labeled Priority Ultra was placed aboard AC-47 transport heading east toward Pearl Harbor. The flight took 4 hours. When it landed, 2 men were waiting, Commander Joseph Rockefort and his assistant, Lieutenant Layton, both veterans of the Navy's cryptanalytic unit. They had cracked parts of this code before, but this one looked different. It carried weight. The decoding room sat deep inside the Pearl Harbor intelligence compound, its windows painted over, its lights dimmed to protect the secrecy. The air was thick with heat and cigarette smoke. Machines clattered, translators murmured over phonetic tables, and the soft tick of a wall clock filled the silence between transmissions. At 11:15 p.m., Rockefort looked up from his notepad. "Read that line again," he said. The translator obeyed. A hush fell. The message, routine on the surface, contained exact coordinates, time of departure, aircraft types, and an inspection route across the Solomon Islands. The sender, Imperial Japanese Navy Command. The passenger, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Layton exhaled. "It can't be real," he whispered. He'd never broadcast his own route. But the math held. The call signs matched those previously linked to Yamamoto's personal staff. The itinerary was exact. Depart Rabaul, 9:34 a.m. local time, April 18, 1943. Arrive Balale Airfield, 10:45. Escort of 60 fighters. 2 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers. The room went still. Someone finally said it aloud. "We know where he'll be. To the minute." Rockefort's pen froze midair. For 2 years they had hunted shadows, convoys, fleets, false trails. But this was the man who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor. The man whose plans had killed over 2,000 Americans in a single morning. "If this is true," Layton murmured, "we can end the war before it ends us." Rockefort didn't answer. He walked to the map pinned to the wall, tracing a red pencil line from Rabaul to the Western Solomons. The route cut through open ocean, perfect for an ambush. Yet something in him hesitated. Intelligence was never pure. It was built on doubt, coincidence, luck. "We'll confirm through the next intercept," he said, though he already knew what Washington would decide. Outside, the night air smelled of oil and rain. Down at the docks, ships rocked gently against their moorings, their searchlights sweeping the water like restless eyes. The war seemed far away, and yet it pulsed through every radio frequency, every coded syllable, every cautious breath of the men inside that room. By dawn, a cable had already been drafted to the Office of Naval Intelligence. The wording was clinical. Confirmed itinerary, Admiral Yamamoto, Commander Combined Fleet. Opportunity for interception, April 18th. One of the junior officers hesitated before signing. "Sir, if this leaks, if they realize we've broken Jan 25. Rockefort interrupted him. "Then we've lost the only weapon sharper than a bomb." Silence. The message left Pearl Harbor sealed in a brown envelope marked "Eyes Only." Within 24 hours it would sit on the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz in Washington, and before the week was over, on the desk of President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. For now, the cryptanalysts sat in the dim light, exhausted and uneasy. They had done their job, and in doing it, they might have changed the course of the war, or crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In the corner, Layton flipped through the decoded sheet again, unable to stop reading the same words. Betty Bomber, 60 escorts, Balale Airfield. The simplicity terrified him. Yamamoto trusted his code as he trusted his empire, invincible, disciplined, absolute. Rockefort stubbed out his cigarette, leaving a black ring on the table. "We'll forward the coordinates," he said quietly, "and let Washington decide what kind of war this is going to be." Outside, The Hawaiian dawn broke pale and indifferent over the harbor that Yamamoto himself had once turned into a furnace. The sea was calm again, deceptively so. The operators switched off their radios one by one, unaware that the signal they had caught would set 18 American pilots into the sky, flying more than 1,000 miles to meet a single plane. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the steady ticking of the clock, counting down to a meeting neither side was supposed to survive. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It wasn't an order yet. It was a question whispered in a war room. Washington, D.C., April 15, 1943. The Navy's top floor was awake long before sunrise. In a narrow chamber behind locked doors, a group of men stood around a large map of the Pacific. Coffee cups sat untouched. The air smelled of ink, tobacco, and fatigue. The message from Pearl Harbor had arrived only hours earlier. It was stamped top secret, ultra source. Inside, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the decoded transmission twice before looking up. "They're certain?" he asked. The officer from Naval Intelligence nodded. "Yes, sir. It's Yamamoto. The route, the time, the aircraft, all confirmed." The name hung in the room like smoke. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. The man who had promised to dictate peace in the White House. Nimitz turned to his staff. "If we strike him, Japan loses its head. But if we move too soon, they'll know we've broken Jan. 25. Silence. Only the distant hum of air conditioning. A young intelligence officer shifted nervously and spoke. "Sir, this isn't a battle. It's an execution." Across the table, another replied. "Tell that to the 2,000 men he killed in Honolulu." The room fractured, some speaking of vengeance, others of ethics. What was the line between strategy and assassination? Between justice and revenge? Nimitz let them argue. He stared at the map, at the fragile red arc drawn over the Solomon Islands. Finally, he said quietly, "If we act, we must never reveal how we knew." The following morning, the cable reached the White House. Roosevelt read it over breakfast, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall summarized the stakes. "We can intercept Yamamoto's plane, but only if we act now. It's a one-time opportunity." The president looked out the window toward the White House lawn. Spring sunlight glinted off the fountain. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he set the paper down, adjusted his glasses, and said simply, "Get Yamamoto." The words were not shouted, not even emphasized. Yet every man in that room felt their weight. From that moment, Operation Vengeance began to take shape, so secret that only a handful of officers would ever know its full extent. Orders moved through coded channels, disguised as routine dispatches. The pilots who would carry them out were told nothing of who their real target was. At the Army Air Force's briefing in Guadalcanal, the commander, Major John Mitchell, studied the plan. The mission was nearly suicidal. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flying more than 400 miles each way, over open sea, at wavetop altitude to avoid radar. The target, an enemy aircraft that would appear for only a few minutes before vanishing again into the jungle. Mitchell asked one question. "How do we know he'll be there?" The intelligence officer hesitated. "We have good information. Good enough to die for. Good enough to change the war." The plan demanded precision down to the second. The P-38s would depart Guadalcanal at 7:25 a.m., fly 435 miles west at 30 meters above the water, and intercept 2 Japanese bombers and 60 escorts near Bougainville at exactly 9:34 a.m., the same time listed in the decoded message. There was no room for error. In Washington, a final meeting sealed the operation. Admiral Ernest King warned that if the Japanese realized how their code was compromised, years of intelligence work would collapse. "We can't afford a victory that blinds us," he said. Nimitz answered, "We can't afford to let him live." The mission remained unsigned until midnight, when Roosevelt's private secretary brought in a single sheet of paper. The president had written 2 words in pencil at the bottom. Approved. FDR. At that hour, in a hangar half a world away, mechanics were already fitting long-range fuel tanks onto the silver wings of P-38s. Their hands worked quickly under the yellow light, unaware that history was forming in the oil-stained air around them. In a small office nearby, Major Mitchell stared at a rough map pinned to the wall. The red line curved across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. It looked like madness, and maybe it was. He touched the edge of the paper and murmured, "We'll need to be ghosts." When he briefed his pilots the next morning, he kept his tone steady. "We're going hunting," he said. "Target, high value. We hit fast, get out faster. No radio, no chatter. If you're hit, head east and pray the fuel holds." Someone in the back asked, "Who are we going after?" Mitchell hesitated, then lied. "A senior officer. That's all you need to know." Outside, the tropical rain began to fall, tapping against the metal fuselages like a slow heartbeat. The men stood silent, each lost in his own thoughts. They didn't know it yet, but within 72 hours they would be flying into one of the most precise, improbable missions in the history of aerial warfare. Far away, in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto slept soundly, confident that his empire's codes were unbreakable. He had planned his trip with military precision, down to the minute of his arrival. The man who once said, "The Americans are too soft for a long war," was about to meet the hard edge of it. And in Washington, the lights of the war room stayed on long after midnight. The men inside didn't celebrate. They simply waited, because they knew that once the first engine started, there would be no turning back. The order had been given. The hunters were in motion. And somewhere in the Pacific, the clock began to count down. 18 engines, 1,000 miles, and not a word on the radio. Guadalcanal, April 18th, 1943. The runway steamed under a thin skin of morning heat. Ground crews moved like silhouettes in the glare, dragging hoses, checking seams, thumping the bellies of long-range tanks bolted under silver wings. The P-38 Lightnings crouched nose to tail, twin booms throwing hard shadows across the coral strip. Inside each cockpit, a pilot sat very still, hands rehearsing motions they wouldn't be allowed to speak. Major John Mitchell walked the line once, palm grazing aluminum as if blessing a procession. He didn't give a speech. He only held up 3 fingers, 3 rules: stay low, stay silent, stay on time. Then he climbed in, pulled the canopy down, and the world narrowed to glass, gauges, and the thud of his own pulse. At 7:25, the first Lightning leapt forward, props clawing the air. The rest followed in pairs, wheels kicking up dust that tasted like rust. They cleared the palms and dropped to wavetop height, skimming the Pacific so low the prop washed stitched lines on the water. The ocean stretched flat and endless, a polished sheet of blue that could hide nothing and everything at once. No radio, no chatter. The formation held by memory and math, headings written in grease pencil on knee boards, timing marks scratched onto watch crystals. Fuel needles crept down in steady arcs. Each man had 3 drop tanks plumbed into his lifeline. If one leaked, he'd never see home. A crewman had joked in the pre-dawn gloom, "You can smell a leak before you see it." Now they all imagined the scent. Tom Lanfear flew starboard high in the first element, jaw tight, eyes watering from the slipstream that found every crack in the canopy. He'd tucked a letter beneath his seat for his mother. 2 paragraphs, neat as a parade ground. "If this reaches you, it means I did not. Don't grieve long. A man asks for work worthy of him." He didn't let himself touch it again. Superstition is a form of fuel. The Lightnings 8 miles like patient animals, 30 feet above the water. Then 20. Mitchell glanced left, saw faces turned gray-green by reflection, and held his altitude anyway. The sea threw up occasional white scars where schools of fish broke the surface. Every flash yanked a pilot's head a fraction off course before discipline hauled it back. An hour passed measured only by tremor in the yoke and the slow migration of sunlight across the panel. The men's bodies answered the strain in small betrayals. Calves cramping, mouths gone dry, forearms buzzing. In the distance, Bougainville rose out of haze, dark ridges like knuckles punching through the ocean's skin. Somewhere beyond those hills ran a thin, dotted line on a map, the inspection route of an admiral who believed his code could not be read. Mitchell checked his watch. 9:20. They were on the edge of the intercept triangle now, the geometry of murder drawn in pencil. He raised a hand, a small motion, all he could allow, and the 4 assigned to form the kill flight eased up, climbing as gently as breath to be in position above the expected path. The rest slid wide to screen against zeros. Still no radios. A flock without voices. Lanfear felt the air change, a tiny looseness, a higher, thinner note in the engines as the formation lifted off the sea. The Lightning stepped to 1,500 feet, then 2,000, their long noses aimed at a gap in the hills where jungle spilled down to a pale bite of beach. If Yamamoto kept his schedule, he would be there in minutes. 2G-4M Betty bombers flanked by 6 fighters. The Americans would get a single clean pass. After that, chaos. A gull flashed past, white wing gone. Someone's gloved hand made a small circle, steady, steady. There is a sound pilots know when a sky is about to grow teeth. It isn't loudness. It's a pressure, like weather turning. Mitchell felt it before he saw anything. A sense of being observed by something still invisible. He forced himself to scan right, left, right. Pattern drilled into bone. Feel good. Temps good. Men holding. 9:31. The coastline sharpened. A river mouth showed as a brown thread in the green. Tiny surf stitched the beach like lace. Further out, sunlight struck the water with blinding insistence. Beyond that, the horizon drew its perfect lie. They reached the point and began a shallow left turn, settling into the last leg. The plan's clockwork ticked in unseen gears. Yamamoto wheels up at 9:34 from Rabaul. Cruise speed 180 knots. Escort vigilant but predictable. Every minute a rung on a ladder the Americans had already climbed on paper. It would all mean nothing if the first sighting came 10 seconds late. Lanfear's eyes ached from searching. He blinked hard, counted breaths, whispered without keying the mic. Come on. Mitchell pressed the heel of his hand once against the throttles, a grounding gesture, the way a man steadies himself on a rail before a train appears. The ocean ahead lifted slightly and resolved into 2 small imperfections. Not waves, not birds. Dots, black, precise, moving where nothing else moved. Lanfear's mouth went dry. He leaned forward as if he could climb through the plexiglass. The dots elongated, paired commas on the blue. Then, behind them, flecks, smaller, quicker, escorts fanning like hornets. A human need older than radios broke through discipline. Lanfear's thumb found the transmit key and pressed just enough to feel it click. His voice came out low, ragged with certainty, a whisper meant for one man and heard by all. That's him. At 9:34 a.m., the jungle below was silent. At 9:35, hell opened its eyes. The skies over Bougainville shimmered with heat, pale blue bleeding into the green crush of jungle beneath. For hours, the American P-38 Lightnings had crept across the Pacific, engines throttled low, shadows flickering over the water. Now, as the coastline rose beneath them, every man's breath tightened. They were exactly on time. Major John Mitchell, leading the formation, glanced at his wristwatch, 9:34. He gave a quick hand signal, 2 fingers forward. No radio, no words. The plan's precision depended on silence. And then, out of the thin haze ahead, 2 faint silver-green shapes appeared, Mitsubishi Betty bombers. 6 darker specks flanked them like angry wasps, 0 fighters. Lanfear, flying high on the right, felt his pulse slam. We have them, he mouthed, no sound reaching the air. He looked down the line, every lightning poised, throttles trembling. Mitchell raised one gloved fist, then opened it. Attack. The lightnings peeled from formation like blades unsheathed. The sudden drop tore the still air apart, a scream of turbines and gravity. The jungle rushed up beneath them, green and burning in the sunlight. The lead bombers gleamed ahead, engines flashing, unaware of the death diving from the clouds. Lanfear's gunsight framed the tail of the first Betty. He squeezed the trigger. 6. 50 caliber machine guns roared to life, tracers streaking through the humid air like molten needles. The Japanese bomber shuddered as the rounds stitched across its fuselage. Flames erupted from its right wing. Yamamoto's escort Zeros broke formation in panic, spiraling to intercept. The sky, empty a heartbeat before, exploded into chaos. Mitchell's radio stayed dead by design. No chatter, only the mechanical language of combat. The roll, the flare, the fire. One lightning banked hard left, a 0 on its tail. The ocean flashed below. Another American dove straight through the formation, his guns hammering. Lanfear caught a glimpse of the second Betty, gliding low over the treetops, trying to flee inland. He shoved the throttles forward, engines screaming, nose dipping until the trees blurred. His tracer fire reached out again, long, searing lines of red light. The bomber lurched. Its right engine coughed, flamed, died. Inside that bomber sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, his gloved hand steady on the armrest, his face composed even as the cockpit filled with smoke. His pilot fought the controls, desperate to level the wings, but the right side tore away in fire. The aircraft twisted once, twice, then vanished into the jungle canopy. A column of black smoke rose like a pillar into the tropical sky. Lanfear didn't cheer. He didn't even breathe. He banked hard to avoid collision, watching through the smoke as the second bomber disintegrated. The jungle swallowed it whole. The air battle raged above him. 2 Zeros dove from the sun, their guns sparking. Mitchell's wingman took hits across his tail, metal peeling like paper. A lightning caught fire and spiraled toward the sea, its pilot bailing out too low. The rest broke into pairs, turning, climbing, falling. There was no formation now, only fragments of movement and instinct. Lanfear's canopy rattled with a near miss. He jerked left, then right, the G-force crushing his chest. Easy, easy, he muttered through gritted teeth, though no one could hear him. Another Zero flashed past his nose, trailing smoke. The American fired, a short burst, and saw the Japanese fighter tear open along the fuselage before diving into the trees. For 20 minutes, the sky boiled. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The Japanese escorts, bleeding fuel and fury, turned south, limping toward Rabaul. The remaining lightnings regrouped in silence, their engines the only sound over the hum of the jungle. Mitchell circled once, scanning below. Through the gap in the foliage, he saw the scar where Yamamoto's bomber had gone down. Trees flattened, a thin column of gray smoke twisting upward. He didn't say the words, but everyone knew. The man who had brought Pearl Harbor to its knees was gone. At 9:45, somewhere below that green inferno, a pocket watch on a dead man's wrist stopped ticking. No one celebrated. War doesn't allow clean victories. Mitchell raised his hand again, motioning east. Time to go home. But the thought hung heavy between them. The mission wasn't over. Their fuel was low. The Japanese would come hunting. As the lightnings turned toward the endless Pacific, the sky grew quiet again. The smoke faded into distance. The jungle, indifferent witness to history, resumed its own rhythm. Cicadas, birds, the far-off rumble of surf. No one spoke over the radio. No one dared. Each man flew in the silence of his thoughts. They had struck the heart of their enemy and seen it stop beating. But now the ocean stretched beneath them like a promise and a threat at once. Blue, beautiful, and merciless. Mitchell glanced back once more, toward the vanishing column of smoke, and then forward, toward home. His face was calm, unreadable, because the hardest part was just beginning. The sky was blue, the sea endless, and their fuel gauges nearly empty. They leveled out over open water, noses pointing east, engines leaning into a thin, careful hum. The jungle fell behind like a door closing. No one spoke. The radios, silent by design on the way in, stayed silent now out of fear. Fear of drawing attention, fear of hearing a voice that wouldn't answer back. Major John Mitchell checked his watch, then his fuel. The 3 drop tanks on each P-38 had been their lifeline on the way out. Now they were mostly air and prayer. He raised one hand. 2 sharp motions. Hold altitude, hold heading. The formation tried to knit itself together again, but the sky, just torn by gunfire, didn't heal that fast. Pairs drifted, singles lagged. The ocean below glittered like broken glass. Tom Lanfear felt the lightning's vibration in his teeth. He glanced at the needle, willing it not to move. The bullet holes along his right wing had turned whisper into whistle. The slipstream sang a note he'd never forget. He slid a photograph from his breast pocket, the one of his mother on the porch, pressed it flat against the map, and tucked it back. Keep your hands busy, keep your head clear. Behind the lead element, a straggler coughed smoke. Mitchell waited for a sign, a thumbs up, a waggle, but the P-38 kept sinking, its pilot fighting the dead weight of a shot-up tank. Finally, the wing dipped in a small, helpless arc. The plane fell away, low, lower, then kissed the ocean with a white bloom and vanished. No parachute, no flare, just a widening ring on blue. If the Japanese spot us now, someone whispered to himself, not to the radio, we're fish food. Fuel planning had been arithmetic on the ground, elegant and exact. Up here, heat, holes, and adrenaline were crooked accountants. A second lightning bled speed, pilot choosing between altitude and economy, both bad. He eased toward a tiny raft of cloud, said something silent to whatever listened over empty water, and pulled the release. The drop tanks let go, splashing like stones. Lighter now, but with less to drink. He aimed for a smudge on the horizon that might have been a weather line, might have been hope. Mitchell kept them low, too low for radar, and just high enough to cheat the sea. Sweat pooled under flight suits. Thirst crawled behind teeth. A gull crossed their path, the only white thing moving besides wake lines from invisible fish. They passed a dark stain where oil spread wide on the surface. Not their oil, someone else's. A reminder, the Pacific did not keep secrets. It kept trophies. One by one, the P-38s found the rhythm again. Throttle, trim, trim again. Lean the mixture, watch the temp, don't stare at the gauge. The formation became a long, broken necklace of silver beads skimming the planet's edge. Behind them, somewhere, the Japanese were already climbing into the air, angry, searching, too late. Ahead of them lay only distance. Hours stretched. Time became a measurement of thirst and engine note. A pilot coughed into his oxygen mask, listened to the sound of his own lungs, and counted heartbeats between waves. Another muttered a navigation fix under his breath, the way a man says a prayer when he no longer remembers the words. At last, a smudge rose on the world's rim, Guadalcanal crouching under cloud. The first element lifted a little, trading drop of fuel for a better glide. Landing gear came down in staggered clunks. Tires met coral. Brakes hissed. 1, 2, 3, then a pause. The tower stayed mute. The ground crew watched with hands on caps, as if noise might frighten the survivors away. A lightning touched down on one wheel, skittered, straightened. Another rolled so long it coasted past the line and stopped in the grass, props ticking as they cooled. The pilots didn't climb out right away. They sat with their hands on their thighs, letting the engine tremor fade from their bones. No cheers, no backslaps, just breath. Count the returns. 18 lifted, 10 made it back. 2 had ditched and never resurfaced. Others limped to distant strips or never saw the shoreline. The field swallowed the number like a secret it had been waiting to keep. Debrief was a room with a table, pencils, and orders. You did not see what you saw. You will not say what you did. The source of the mission is never to be discussed. The word vengeance appeared once on a sheet, then vanished into a folder stamped classified and pushed to the back of a safe where it would sleep for 20 years. Lanfear handed over his report in tight, spare lines. Engaged enemy bombers. One observed descending in flames inland. He did not write the name he had carried in his head all morning. Mitchell's note was shorter still. Intercept executed as briefed. Fuel critical. Recommend no repetition without tanker support. The officer reading nodded without looking up. His hand shook anyway. Night fell fast in the islands. The pilots walked to the edge of the strip and stared into dark that smelled like oil and rain. Somewhere out there, the jungle burned in a single wound of smoke. Somewhere under it lay a watch stopped at 9:45, on a wrist that had signed the order for Pearl Harbor. A mechanic passed with a lantern, glanced at the bullet holes in the wings, and didn't ask. A medic pressed canteens into filthy hands. Someone laughed once, too loud, then covered his mouth as if the sound were a leak. They had killed not just a man, but a symbol. They had changed the war's arithmetic by a fraction that felt enormous and impossible at once. And none of them knew if they were allowed to be proud, or if pride would cost them whatever pieces of themselves still fit together. 3 days later, word would drift across the ocean like driftwood. A Japanese search party had found a wreck in the green, and what sat inside it. No details. Not yet. For now, the Pacific exhaled, and the men who had flown into its mouth tried to learn the taste of silence again. To the Japanese, he was untouchable, a living god. And gods weren't supposed to fall from the sky. 2 days after the ambush, on the morning of April 20th, 1943, a Japanese search team made its way through the jungle of Bougainville. The air was heavy with the smell of damp leaves and burned metal. Vines tangled around their legs as they cut through with machetes, listening to the hum of insects and the distant murmur of surf. Then, through the trees, wreckage. A silver fuselage torn open like paper, its nose buried deep in the red earth. One of the soldiers gasped. The jungle around it had been scorched bare. Bamboo stalks stood ghost-white in the heat. Smoke still rose faintly from the twisted engines. Captain Hamasuna lifted his hand. Silence fell. They moved forward carefully, as though entering a temple. Near the cockpit, under a broken wing, someone called softly, "Here." The man in the front seat, the pilot, was gone, his uniform blackened. But the passenger behind him sat, as if asleep. His white gloves were still clean. His sword rested against his knee. A small wound marked his left shoulder. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of Pearl Harbor, had died instantly. He died as he lived, Hamasuna whispered, perfectly composed. The soldiers bowed their heads. For a long time, no one moved. The jungle buzzed around them, but it sounded distant, unreal. One of the men began to hum, not a song of victory, but a prayer. They wrapped the body in a silk flag and carried it out through the green silence, step by step, toward the shore. That night, under a tarp near the coast, they lit a small fire. Yamamoto's sword was placed beside him. The flames caught quickly, bright and clean, and the smoke drifted out toward the sea he had ruled. The men stood in a circle, motionless. No one cried. At dawn, the ashes were collected and placed in a wooden urn. The captain sealed it with his own hands. "Even the gods can die," he said quietly. No one replied. In Tokyo, the news was rewritten before it was told. The radio voice trembled as it read the official line. Admiral Yamamoto was killed in aerial combat while leading his men bravely. The truth, that his flight had been ambushed, his movements known to the minute, was buried deep in military files. The nation went into mourning. Black banners hung from government buildings. Factories stopped for 1 minute of silence. People knelt before his photograph, as if before a shrine. But among the officers, the mood was darker. Some refused to believe it. Others understood too well. "If even he can die," a young lieutenant murmured. "What's left of the empire?" In the following weeks, his death became legend. Children in school learned that he had died in the air, sword in hand. Artists painted him rising toward the heavens. But soldiers at the front whispered another version, that the Americans had hunted him with impossible precision and that the gods had looked away. On April 21st, the urn arrived in Tokyo. Thousands lined the streets in silence as the funeral procession passed. Women laid flowers. Men saluted. No one spoke. That night, the emperor's message was broadcast. His spirit shall guide us to victory. But for many, victory already felt like a word from another world. The watch found on Yamamoto's wrist had stopped at 9:45 a.m. Its face was cracked, but the hands remained visible, frozen forever in that moment above Bougainville. It was sent to Tokyo, displayed years later in the Yasukuni Shrine. Visitors still stand before it, staring at the stillness of time itself. He had once written in a private letter, "In war, there are no miracles, only consequences." Now his death had become both the end of a man and the beginning of Japan's slow fall. Across the Pacific, 18 American pilots were ordered to forget. They could not speak of what they had done, not even to one another. The mission was classified, buried under ink and silence. But history, like the ocean, never stays still. They came back as heroes, but they couldn't tell anyone why. Guadalcanal, 3 days after the mission. The mess hall buzzed with tin plates and chair legs, the ordinary noise of a war still grinding forward. At one corner table, the P-38 pilot sat close and quiet, sunburned faces and oil-black knuckles wrapped around coffee that had gone cold. Men drifted past to slap shoulders, to say hell of a show up there, not knowing what show it had been. The pilots nodded and looked at their hands. Major John Mitchell was summoned first. The orderly opened the door, eyes avoiding his. "Sir, the Admiral will see you." In the operations hut, the air smelled of map varnish and stale tobacco. A secure line from Pearl crackled. Mitchell stood, cap tucked under his arm, while a clipped voice relayed orders from above. Officially, this never happened. Mitchell blinked. "Sir, you heard me. No mission, no target, no discussion. Debrief is sealed. Source remains undisclosed for the duration." The line went dead. Papers slid across the desk, statements to sign. Classified, indefinite stamped in red at the top. A young intelligence lieutenant couldn't meet his eyes as he tapped the blotter. "For your protection, Major." And for hours. Back in the mess, the men watched Mitchell's face for clues. He sat, folded the forms into a neat square, and said only, "We flew. We returned. That's all." A murmur rippled through the room, then broke on the edges of ordinary talk. Weather over Munda, mail ship delayed, a poker game at 1900. The crowd swallowed the story because it had no words to chew. At night, the island fell into its familiar chorus, generators throbbing, palms ticking like rain on canvas. In the barracks, someone whispered into the dark, "We killed the man who bombed Pearl Harbor, and I still can't sleep." No one answered. The beds creaked once and went still. The next morning, a courier arrived with more paper. The heading read Operation Vengeance. The body of the memo was empty of names. Under awards, a long blank. Recommendations deferred. The adjutant said, eyes tired. Higher authority. The pilots signed more forms promising not to speak to the press, not to write home, not to hint. Silence had been their weapon in the air. Now it became their uniform on the ground. Letters from stateside brought a different kind of noise. Mothers asked what the boys were flying these days. A brother wanted to know if Guadalcanal sunsets were really red, as the newsreels said. Girlfriends enclosed snapshots with lipstick kisses and cheerful threats. The men wrote back about the heat, the food, the way the ocean burned white at noon. Not about a name they had carried in their lungs for 1,000 miles and let out with gunfire. In the intel shack, a safe swallowed the mission file. The code that had made it possible, Jan 25, remained a rumor fenced in by acronyms. A captain from Navy Communications locked the door and said, "If the Japanese learn we read them, they change the book. If they change the book, men die." He closed the ledger as if closing a mouth. Sometimes a mechanic would ask, half joking, "So what did you boys bag out there?" Lanfear would shrug. 2 bombers, some fighters, some luck." The mechanic would whistle, satisfied, and go back to safety wire and torque. The truth sat in the corner like an unarmed guard, present, unacknowledged. One evening the chaplain stopped by the revetments with a tin of cigarettes. He handed them out without scripture. "You did hard work," he said. "Some hard work doesn't have parades." Mitchell managed a smile that didn't hold. "Some hard work can't have a name," he said. The base carried on. Missions launched, missions landed. Men rotated out, bronze and thin. A few months later, 2 of the pilots found themselves sitting beside each other on a transport, hands wrapped around canteens. "Do you ever say it, even in your head?" one asked. The other shook his head. "If I start, I won't stop." Years would pass before any of them saw the word ultra in print, before any briefing room admitted that a transmission at 9:34 had written a man's fate. In the meantime, the mission lived as a rumor that tasted like metal, present in the mouth, unspoken by the tongue. Orders changed, units moved. The island rains came early. A radio in the mess coughed static, and then a careful voice from Tokyo speaking of national mourning, a funeral pyre, a spirit returning to the sea. The men looked up without looking at one another. Someone turned the volume down. Plates clinked. Life insisted on its chores. That night, Mitchell opened the footlocker under his cot and slid the signed secrecy forms beneath a folded shirt. He took out his watch, wounded, and listened. The tick was ordinary, human. He imagined another watch, stopped in a jungle no one in the room would ever see, and felt no triumph. Only the strange lightness of a task completed and the heavier weight of what it had cost. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz drafted a sentence for a report that would never be public. Strategic effect, significant. Source security, paramount. He set down his pen and stared at the harbor where the water was still bright over the scars. Mercy and vengeance do not wear uniforms, he thought. Men do. The pilots slept badly, woke early, flew again. They would not have medals for what they could not name. They would have only the knowledge that precision and silence, joined for one morning over Bougainville, had shortened the war's long shadow by an inch. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Tokyo prepared a funeral fit for a myth. Black flags rose. Crowds formed. The empire rehearsed its grief. And with the drums of mourning came the first real tremor, small but steady, in the belief that Japan could not be broken. He was the only man in Japan who could say no to the emperor. Now, there was no one left to say it. Tokyo, April 1943. Black flags hung from balconies, and the city moved in slow procession beneath a gray sky. Loudspeakers repeated the same official line. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto has fallen in aerial combat while bravely leading his men. School children froze at attention. Factory whistles stopped for a minute of silence. Japan was performing its grief like a national ritual, precise, rehearsed, and hollow. Inside the Navy Ministry, the mood was different. Maps lay open, pins unmoved. Cigarettes burned untouched in ashtrays. Officers stood in silence, not out of respect, but confusion. For years, Yamamoto's voice had been the only one that could turn argument into decision. He had warned them long before Pearl Harbor. If we go to war with America, we will run wild for 6 months. Then I have no confidence. The war had lasted 6 months, almost to the day. And now the man who had predicted its limit was gone. Prime Minister Tojo's cabinet met behind closed doors. Plans were reviewed, revised, and discarded in minutes. Without him, one officer said quietly, "The fleet is a body without a brain." No one disagreed. The funeral was magnificent and unbearable. White flowers rained down on the slow black car that carried his urn. Crowds lined the streets in silence. In homes and schools, people wept to the voice on the radio describing the hero's death. But under the grief was something new, fear. If the Americans could find and kill Yamamoto, what else could they do? What secrets had already been read? In the weeks that followed, the empire faltered. Orders from Tokyo arrived late. Admirals hesitated to commit ships. Pilots whispered that the Americans always seemed to know where they would strike. "We are sailing blind," a destroyer captain wrote in his log. "The compass still works, but the direction is gone." At Rabaul, an intelligence officer studied intercepted Allied messages and shivered at the silence between them. "They are listening to us," he said. "Or worse, they already know what we have not yet decided." His warning was ignored. Propaganda filled the void. Posters showed Yamamoto in a shining uniform, sword raised toward heaven. Newspapers called him the spirit of eternal victory. But soldiers at the front had stopped believing. A sergeant in New Guinea wrote home, "If the gods could die in the sky, maybe they were never gods at all." In truth, Yamamoto had been both the empire's greatest weapon and its last restraint. He was the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, and the man who knew it had awakened something Japan could never defeat. His death removed not only a commander, but a conscience. After the memorial, a young midshipman stood at the edge of Tokyo Bay, watching the tide lap against black water. The radio still played the funeral broadcast, static between words. He pictured the Admiral's final flight, the jungle, the crash, the stopped watch. It was said the hands froze at 9:45. He imagined them ticking again, counting backward toward the moment when everything had still made sense. Factories roared back to life, but the sound had changed. The empire continued because it didn't know how to stop. New admirals took command, but none carried Yamamoto's weight. The fleet fought on, directionless, magnificent, doomed. Across the ocean, the Americans said nothing. The mission was still secret, the name still classified. In mess halls on Guadalcanal, pilots avoided each other's eyes when the radio mentioned Japan's mourning. They had ended the life of a legend, and now carried the silence of it. Years later, historians would trace the beginning of Japan's collapse to that April morning. Yet for those who lived it, the fall was not sudden. It came like erosion, quiet, steady, unstoppable. A voice once strong enough to command oceans was gone, and the waves obeyed no one. And in that silence, on both sides of the war, a single question began to echo. Was it justice or vengeance that changed the course of the Pacific? They called it Operation Vengeance. But in the end, it wasn't vengeance at all. California, 2 decades later. The war was history now, printed, bound, and simplified. But in a small veterans club in Fresno, the story lived in quieter voices. The air smelled of dust, whiskey, and cigarette smoke. On one wall hung a black and white photo of P-38 Lightnings in formation. Below it, a framed newspaper clipping read, "Yamamoto's death confirmed, files declassified." John Mitchell, older now, hair gone to steel, sat with 2 of his former pilots. The world had moved on, through Korea, through peace treaties, through the rise of new enemies. But the mission had followed them like a second shadow. Someone poured another drink. Someone else broke the silence. So it's out there now, Lanfear said, tapping the newspaper. All those years of not talking, and it turns into 3 paragraphs. Mitchell smiled faintly. 3 paragraphs and 1 photo. That's history for you. They fell quiet again. Outside, the highway hummed. Inside, time moved differently, slower, heavier. Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded page from a military journal. Listen to this, he said. He read aloud. I didn't see an enemy that day. I saw a man who believed as deeply as we did. The words had been written by another pilot, long retired. They hung in the room like the smoke. He was right, Mitchell said. We never saw his face, but we knew what kind of man he was. Dedicated. Precise. Doomed by the same duty that kept us flying. Lanfear nodded. You ever wonder if he wanted out? Mitchell didn't answer at first. Then, I read he carried letters to his family that day. Said he was tired. Said he hoped the war would end soon. He paused. We all hoped that, didn't we? They sat with that thought. 3 men bound by an event no celebration could contain. On the table lay medals, keys, a lighter engraved with 43. Each object felt heavier than it should. In the years after the war, the truth had come slowly. The intercepted code, the moral gamble, the precision of the ambush. The public called it brilliant. The pilots knew better. Brilliance was easy to name from a distance. Up close, it was just noise, heat, and a watch stopping in a jungle. Mitchell glanced toward the wall clock. The second hand swept on, indifferent. His stopped at 9:45, he murmured. That's what they said. Lanfear looked up. Maybe that was when the war started ending. The others didn't laugh. They knew what he meant. The death of a leader had cut deeper than any victory report. It had proved that even the architects of destruction could fall, that war devoured its own creators first. Years later, when the story appeared in textbooks, it was stripped of its weight. Students memorized dates, numbers, flight paths. But none of that captured the silence afterward. The way the men couldn't sleep, the way they avoided each other's eyes during briefings, the way the Pacific looked when you just changed history and didn't know if it mattered. One of the veterans' wives entered, carrying coffee. You boys still talking about that old flight? She asked with a small smile. Not talking, Mitchell said. Remembering. She nodded and left them to it. The room fell still again. A record player crackled with Glenn Miller, and for a moment the sound carried them back. The smell of aviation fuel, the sting of salt air, the horizon that seemed endless until it wasn't. Mitchell stood, picked up his cap, and looked at the photo one last time. We thought killing him would end it, he said softly. But wars don't end that way, do they? Lanfear answered, almost to himself. No. They end when you stop hating. Outside, the California sun fell through the window, striking the photograph so that the silver plane seemed almost alive again, caught in mid-flight, heading towards something no one could ever reach. At 9:45 that morning in 1943, a watch had stopped in a jungle. For the men who carried out the order, it never truly started again. They had ended a war's architect. But what truly ended that day was the illusion that war could ever be clean. And somewhere in that silence, beyond revenge, beyond duty, lay the smallest kind of victory, the one where an enemy finally became human.